So today we are going to discuss about a very important and yet interesting topic, that is going to be about menstrual cycle. So throughout my clinical practice, I have noticed that so many students have doubt about this menstrual cycle. Let's say that they have, which has a negative feedback and FSH, what is LH, what has a negative feedback and LH and everything. So we are going to have a very conceptual and yet clear discussion on menstrual cycle today. So let's start with the discussion. Okay, so every female has a regular menstrual cycle. Okay, every female will experience regular menstrual cycle. That is most common. So the duration of a regular menstrual cycle is going to be about 28 days. Few females may have a few days variation. Let's say, for example, they may have a shorter cycle than 28 days, or they may have some longer cycle more than 28 days. But on an average, the regular menstrual cycle is about a 28-day cycle. Okay, so in this 28-day cycle, we have divided this into day 1, day 14 and day 28. So between day 1 and day 14, it is actually the proliferative phase of the menstrual cycle. The proliferative phase is also known as the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. Between day 14 and day 28 is known as the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle, or the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. We'll discuss in detail why it is known as follicular phase and why it is known as luteal phase as well. But as of now, the first half of the menstrual cycle is known as proliferative or follicular phase, and the second half of the menstrual cycle is known as secretory phase or the luteal phase. Okay, so now what is this day 14? So ideally, in a female who experiences regular menstrual cycle for a period of about 28 days, the day of ovulation happens on day 14 of a menstrual cycle. So what is the day of ovulation? Ovulation is the process where a female is going to release the ovum. So the process of release of ovum, which is ovulation, is going to happen in day 14 of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so the day of ovulation as well as the day of fertilization is also going to be the same, because once the ovum is going to be released and the female is going to have active coitus, so it will result in fertilization. So definitely the day of ovulation and day of fertilization is going to be same, and that is around day 14 of the menstrual cycle. Yes? Okay. Now, the proliferative, the follicular phase, proliferative phase, which is also known as the follicular phase, is actually variable. It can be either shortened or it can be either lengthened. So it is variable. Whereas the secretory phase or the luteal phase is actually very fixed. It is going to be for a period of about only 14 days. So the secretory phase or the luteal phase is going to last for about 14 days, whereas the proliferative phase is going to be variable. So in order to find the day of ovulation in any patient, you need to check what is the normal cycle length the female is experiencing every month. If the female is going to tell that she is having a regular 28-day cycle, from this 28 days, from the length of the cycle, you have to reduce this 14 days, because these 14 days, the secretory or the luteal phase is going to be a fixed. So since it is fixed, we need to less these 14 days from the length of the female, length of the cycle a female is experiencing. Okay, so length of the cycle is going to be 28, let's say, for example. So from 28, you're going to reduce this 14. So it is going to be around 14. Right? So the day of ovulation is going to be around day 14 of the menstrual cycle. So is this clear now? I hope it is very clear now. So now let's discuss about the menstrual cycle in detail. Okay? Yes. Okay. I hope this color is very clear for you. If at all not, I can change other color. Yeah. Okay. So the first process of menstrual cycle which is going to happen is, we have 4 things. The first thing is going to be from the hypothalamus. Second is we have the pituitary. To be even more particular, it is anterior pituitary. And and then we have the gonads, right? So what is going to happen there? So from the hypothalamus, a hormone called GnRH is getting released. So what is actually GnRH? GnRH is nothing but gonadotropin releasing hormone. So GnRH is actually a gonadotropin releasing hormone, and this GnRH is actually getting released from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. From where it is getting released? It is getting released from the paraventricular nucleus. From the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, this gonadotropin releasing hormone is getting released. Now, depending on the pulse frequency, what it will form. So let's say, for example, if the pulse frequency of this GnRH is going to be high, or whether it is going to be very low. If it is going to be high, it will release LH. If it is going to be very low, it is going to release FSH. What is this LH and FSH? We'll discuss further, but LH is luteinizing hormone. LH is luteinizing hormone. FSH is follicular stimulating hormone. So from where this is getting released? So if the pulse frequency, usually this GnRH, which is getting released from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, is a decapeptide molecule. Okay, so this GnRH will get released in a pulsatile manner. It will release in a pulsatile manner. So it is very important. Only when it is released in a pulsatile manner. What do you mean by pulse? Pulse will have a variability, right? It will have a variability. So only if it is released in a pulsatile manner, it will result in the release of FSH and LH. So if it is going to be a high frequency pulse, LH will be released. If it is going to be a low frequency pulse, FSH will be released. So from where it is actually getting released? So if it is going to be a high frequency pulse, from the anterior pituitary. From the anterior pituitary, FSH will be released. If it is a low frequency, but if it is going to be a high frequency pulsatility index, then because of the high frequency from the hypothalamus, LH is going to be released from the anterior pituitary. So it is actually the anterior pituitary which is releasing the follicular stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, depending on the pulsatility index which is coming from the hypothalamus. So if it is high pulsatility, LH. If it is low pulsatility, it is FSH is going to get released from the pituitary. So now this FSH and LH will act on the gonads. What are the gonads? The gonad is ovary in females. So I hope that until now it is very clear. So from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is a decapeptide, is getting released, and it is getting released in a pulsatile manner. If it is going to be a high frequency pulsatile manner, then LH will get released from the anterior pituitary. If it is going to be a low pulsatility index, then LH will be released from the anterior pituitary. So basically hypothalamus will act on the anterior pituitary. So the GnRH which is getting released from the hypothalamus, that GnRH will act on the anterior pituitary. If it is going to be high pulsatility index, LH will be released. If it is a low pulsatility index, FSH will get released, right? Okay, I hope until now it is very clear. Now let's take this FSH. So now we'll erase this gonads and let's have a detailed discussion. So we saw that two things are getting released, right? One is FSH and the other is LH. Okay, now let's take this FSH. So now this follicular stimulating hormone. What do you mean by follicular stimulating hormone? This hormone is going to stimulate the follicles, right? Am I clear? Yes. So follicular stimulating hormone will stimulate the follicles. So what are the follicles? It will stimulate the primordial follicle. What are primordial follicle? So as we have discussed in oogenesis, these clustered group of cells, as this is going to undergo some kind of mitosis and this primary oocyte is going to form, these clustered follicles of cells are going to get converted into individual cells. So all these individual cells are termed as primordial follicles, and these primordial follicles are surrounded by both the granulosa cells as well as the theca cells. Okay, so let's say for example this is the follicle. Okay, so this primary oocyte, single primary oocyte, will get surrounded by both the granulosa cells as well as the theca cells. So the primary oocyte, which is getting surrounded by the granulosa cells and the theca cells, it is known as primordial follicles. So this FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, will act on the primordial follicles. So this primordial follicles ideally contains three things. One is it has a primary oocyte, and then it has granulosa cells, and then it has theca cells, right? Yes. So since it has granulosa cells and theca cells, from the granulosa cells, so this FSH is acting on the granulosa cells of the primordial follicles. So from the granulosa cells of the primordial follicles, what is going to get released? So from the anterior pituitary, FSH is released. Okay, from the anterior pituitary, FSH is getting released. This FSH will act on the granulosa cells of the primordial follicles. So from the granulosa cells, two things are going to get released. What are those? So one is going to be inhibin B, and the other is going to be estrogen. Okay, one is going to be inhibin B and the other is going to be estrogen, which is a hormone, right? So as the name suggests, inhibin, it is going to inhibit something. So it has a negative feedback on LSH. FSH, sorry, I'm so sorry. This inhibin B will have a negative feedback on FSH. So this FSH is actually giving rise to this inhibin B, but this inhibin B is going to have a negative feedback. It is going to have some negative, it is going to send some negative energy. So it is going to have a negative feedback on this FSH, right? Okay. Now let's take consideration into the estrogen, which is a very important female hormone. Yes, right. Estrogen actually has three important functions. So the first function is that we all know what is the function of the estrogen in uterus. The function of estrogen in the uterus is going to be, it proliferates the uterine endometrial tissue. We all know that uterus has a uterine cavity. In the uterine cavity, endometrium tissue is going to be present. So the main function of estrogen is going to proliferate the uterine endometrium. Right, so it proliferates the uterine endometrium is the primary function, and then it also has a negative feedback on FSH. So we saw that FSH acts on the primordial cells, to be even more particular, granulosa cells of the primordial follicles. From the granulosa cells, inhibin B and estrogen is released. Both the inhibin B as well as estrogen has a negative feedback on FSH. Right, both the inhibin B as well as the estrogen has a negative feedback on FSH. The other function is that it proliferates the uterine endometrium. Estrogen proliferates the uterine endometrium. Estrogen has a negative feedback on FSH. What is the third function? So before discussing about the third function, let's come into consideration about this negative feedback on FSH of estrogen. So since estrogen has a negative feedback on FSH and inhibin B has a negative feedback on FSH, all the follicles which were stimulated by the follicular stimulating hormone stimulates the follicles, right? So all the primordial follicles which were stimulated by the follicular stimulating hormone are going to undergo atresia. They're going to get degenerated, except one follicle, which is going to be the hero here. So except this one follicle, all the follicles which were stimulated by the FSH are going to undergo atresia or degeneration, because this follicular stimulated hormone is actually inhibited by the estrogen and inhibin B. Since it is sending a negative feedback on FSH, the FSH is going to reduce. Since FSH is going to reduce, all the primordial follicles which were stimulated by the follicular stimulating hormone are going to undergo atresia, except one follicle. So since it is the one follicle out of all the follicles, it is termed as the dominant follicle. Except this one dominant follicle, all the follicles will undergo atresia or degeneration, whereas this one dominant follicle will continue to grow. Right? So this one dominant follicle will then continue to grow. So that is the function of this negative feedback on FSH by estrogen and inhibin B. So we have discussed about the two functions of estrogen. One is proliferates the uterine endometrium, and the other is it has a negative feedback on FSH. By this negative feedback, all the follicles are going to undergo atresia except one follicle. Since it is going to be the dominant out of all the follicles, it is a dominant follicle, and this dominant follicle will continue to grow. And the third function is that when the estrogen is present in a concentration about 200 picogram for a period of about 48 hours. If the estrogen is present in a concentration of 200 picogram for a period of about 48 hours, it is going to have a positive feedback on a hormone. It is going to have a positive feedback on luteinizing hormone. We saw that estrogen has a negative feedback on FSH. But estrogen has a positive feedback on LH if estrogen is present in a concentration of 200 picogram for a period of about 48 hours. So because it has a positive feedback on LH, it is going to stimulate the LH. Now LH is actually going to come inside the play. Right? LH is going to come inside play. Now what does LH do? One thing is that we saw in the primordial follicles, there were primary oocytes which was surrounded by the granulosa cells and the theca cells. Now, this LH will act on the theca cells of the primordial follicles. Right? It will act on the theca cells of the primordial follicles. This LH will act and release androgens. Right? Am I clear? Granulosa cells will release estrogen. Right? Theca cells on acting upon luteinizing hormone will release androgens. So granulosa cells release estrogen. Theca cells releases androgens. Now this androgen is not going to remain the same because this androgen is going to enter into the granulosa cell of the primordial follicles. So in the granulosa cells, these androgens are going to convert it into estrogen with the help of a hormone which is termed as aromatase. So with the help of the hormone aromatase, these androgens are going to get converted into estrogen in the granulosa cells. Right? So the one function of LH is that LH is going to act on the theca cells of the follicles, primordial follicles, and from the theca cells, androgen is going to get released. These androgens will enter the granulosa cells, and with the help of the enzyme aromatase, it is going to get converted into estrogen. Right? Okay. Now, what is the other function? The other function is that, see, one thing is that granulosa cells releases only two things, estrogen and inhibin B. And FSH will act on the granulosa cells, whereas this LH will act on both the granulosa cells and the theca cells. So let's have a small note here. See, FSH will act only on the granulosa cells, whereas this LH will act on both the granulosa cells and the theca cells. So until now, we have seen that LH acts on theca cells to release androgens. Androgens enter the granulosa cells to get converted into estrogen with the help of the enzyme aromatase. Now how granulosa cells is that LH will act on the granulosa cells. LH acts on granulosa cells. So luteinizing hormone. The name of the hormone is luteinizing hormone. So it will luteinize the granulosa cells. So since it is going to luteinize the granulosa cells, from the luteinized follicles, there is a hormone which is going to get released. So LH acts on the granulosa cells and it will luteinize it. So this luteinized granulosa cells, from this there is going to be release of a hormone which is termed as progesterone. So only now progesterone has come into play, right? Okay, so initially we saw that from the FSH acts on the granulosa cells of the primordial follicles and releases the inhibin B and estrogen. So estrogen came into play very earlier, but now only when the estrogen is present for present in a concentration of 200 picogram for a period of about 48 hours, it is going to have a positive feedback on LH. Am I clear? Estrogen, when present in 200 picogram for 48 hours, it will have a positive feedback on LH. So since it has a positive feedback on LH, this LH is going to act on theca cells to release androgens, and it acts on LH acts on granulosa cells, and it will luteinize the granulosa cells. So from the luteinized granulosa cells, the hormone progesterone is getting released, and this progesterone is getting released just before the ovulation. So when the progesterone is released just before the ovulation from the luteinized granulosa cells. So from the granulosa cells, what is getting released? It is getting progesterone is getting released. Progesterone is also a female hormone. So progesterone is getting released from luteinized granulosa cells. Okay, so from FSH acts on granulosa cells and releases inhibin B and estrogen. LH acts on the granulosa cells, luteinizes it and releases progesterone. LH acts on the theca cells and releases androgens. These androgens enter the granulosa cells, gets converted into estrogen with the help of the enzyme aromatics. Is it clear now? Yes. Okay. Now what is going to happen? So as we have discussed in the previous module of oogenesis, as the primary oocyte is going to enter into the meiotic division, it is going to get arrested in the diploiding stage of the prophase. And we saw that only around the puberty, only after the puberty, just before the ovulation, this meiotic division, which was arrested in the diploiding stage of prophase, is going to get completed, right? So how does it get completed? It gets completed through a process called LH surge. LH surge. What do you mean by surge? Surge means increase. So what is getting increased here? Luteinizing hormone is getting increased. So this luteinizing hormone will get increased at around a period of time during the menstrual cycle. So since it is going to increase, the meiotic division, which was arrested in the diploiding stage of the prophase, is going to get completed. Meiotic first division is getting completed. So once the meiotic first division completes, we know that two things are going to get released. One is secondary oocyte and the first polar body. So the secondary oocyte is getting released. So since the secondary oocyte is released, this process is termed as ovulation because the secondary oocyte is released. Right? Yes. So along with the secondary oocyte, another thing is going to get released, which is known as corpus luteum. Yes, we can also call it as Cl. Okay, Cl is also known as corpus luteum. Now, you may have this doubt, what is corpus luteum? So the main function of this corpus luteum is that it produces three things. What are the three things? The main hormone which is going to get released is what? And what are the other hormones? So corpus luteum is going to mainly release the progesterone. So progesterone is the main hormone which is released by the corpus luteum, followed by estrogen and then inhibin A. Right? So three things are getting released from this corpus luteum. So at the time of ovulation, whenever ovulation is going to happen in a female, at day 14 of a menstrual cycle, the secondary oocyte is released along with the corpus luteum. Okay, this corpus luteum actually secretes three things. Mainly it produces progesterone, also estrogen and inhibin A. Right? Okay. Now you may have a doubt that what initiates this LH surge? Only LH surge only completes this first meiotic division, which was arrested in the diploiding stage of the prophase. So now what initiates this LH surge? So estrogen initiates this LH surge. Why? Because it's that only when the concentration of estrogen is 200 picogram for a period of about 48 hours, it has a positive feedback on LH, right? Estrogen has a positive feedback on LH only when the concentration of estrogen is present in a concentration of about 200 picogram for 28 hours. So only estrogen has a positive feedback on LH when present in a concentration of 200 picogram. So since then, only because of this positive feedback on LH surge is going to happen. So which is the hormone which initiates the LH surge is actually estrogen. But LH surge is later maintained by both estrogen and progesterone. Maintained by estrogen and progesterone. So, as we have discussed earlier, the hormone which is going to be predominant in the first half of the menstrual cycle, which is the proliferative phase, follicular phase, is going to be estrogen. Right? Why? Because is that the FSH acts on the primordial follicle. From the granulosa cells, estrogen is coming into play. So the first half of the cycle, estrogen is going to be predominant. In the second half of the cycle, progesterone is going to be predominant. Am I correct? Yes, because progesterone is getting released from the luteinized granulosa cells. Progesterone is getting released also from the corpus luteum, which forms after the ovulation. The progesterone is the main hormone which is getting released from the corpus luteum. So the second half of the cycle, progesterone is predominant, and in the first half of the cycle, estrogen is predominant. So first half of the cycle is known as proliferative phase or the follicular phase, since FSH comes into play, and the second half of the cycle is known as secretory phase or the luteal phase, since LH comes into play. So first half of the cycle is all about FSH, second half of the cycle is all about LH. Right? Okay, now how a female experiences menstruation. Why there is menstruation in a female around day 28 day. Now let's discuss about that. For that we need to know about progesterone in detail. So progesterone when present in low concentration, it has a positive feedback on both FSH and LH. But progesterone when present in high concentration, when does progesterone is present in high concentration? After the formation of corpus luteum, because corpus luteum, the main hormone which is produced by the corpus luteum is progesterone. Am I right? So corpus luteum, the main hormone which is released by the corpus luteum is going to be the progesterone. And the activity of the corpus luteum is going to be maximum at around day 22 of the menstrual cycle. In a period of about 28 days, at around day 22 of the cycle, or 8 days after the fertilization or ovulation, at around day 22 of the cycle, the corpus luteum activity is going to be maximum. Since the activity of corpus luteum is going to be maximum at around day 22 of the cycle, corpus luteum only releases progesterone. So definitely the progesterone is going to be remain in a higher concentration at around day 22 of the cycle. So at around day 22 of the cycle, progesterone is going to be in a higher concentration. Right? Yes, so as we have discussed earlier, progesterone in higher concentration has a negative feedback on both FSH and LH. Right? Progesterone in higher concentration has a negative feedback on both LH and FSH. So what is the main function of progesterone first? So the main function of estrogen is that it proliferates the uterine endometrium. So once it proliferates the uterine endometrium, the support to the endometrium is actually provided by the progesterone. So the main function of the progesterone at higher concentration is going to be support the endometrium of the uterus, which was primed by the estrogen. Right? Okay. Now we saw that progesterone in higher concentration has a negative feedback on both FSH and LH. Right? So progesterone in higher concentration has a negative feedback on both FSH and LH. Right. Now, let's say that what is the hormone which maintains the corpus luteum? So we saw that corpus luteum is actually maintained by luteinizing hormone. In non-pregnant females, corpus luteum is actually maintained by the luteinizing hormone, because of this LH surge, the meiotic division is getting completed, and after that the secondary oocyte and the corpus luteum is formed. So luteinizing hormone is the hormone which maintains the corpus luteum, where it is initiated by the estrogen. It is initiated by estrogen and it is maintained by estrogen plus progesterone. but the hormone which maintains the corpus luteum is always luteinizing hormone. So in non-pregnant females, the lifespan of this corpus luteum is around 12 to 16 days. So only for 12 to 16 days, this corpus luteum is going to be maximum. Why? Because is that we saw that progesterone is released in higher concentration. Since it is released by the corpus luteum, it has a negative feedback on FSH and LH, right? And this LH indirectly maintains the corpus luteum. So once the progesterone, it is going to be in the higher concentration, has a negative feedback on LH. LH maintains corpus luteum, right? So as the levels of LH is going to decrease, the corpus luteum is actually going to get degenerated. So once the corpus luteum is getting degenerated, indirectly the progesterone is going to get decreased. Progesterone is going to get decreased. So as the progesterone is going to decrease, what are the things which are going to happen? Progesterone, as we know, progesterone is a smooth muscle relaxant. So all over the body, progesterone is a smooth muscle relaxant. It will actually relax. Since progesterone is lost from the body, smooth muscle relaxant effect is also lost. So there is going to be vasoconstriction. Why vasoconstriction occurs? Because prostaglandin PGF2 alpha is actually getting released from the uterine endometrium. So since progesterone is getting decreased, the support to the endometrium is going to lose. So since the support is going to lose, menstruation is going to occur in a female. We all know that estrogen proliferates the uterine endometrium. Progesterone supports the uterine endometrium. Since the support which the progesterone gives to the uterine endometrium is lost, the endometrium is going to lose its support and bleeding is going to occur. All the endometrial tissue is going to come out as bleeding in a female. And because of the release of prostaglandin PGF2 alpha from the uterine endometrium, because of the shedding, there is going to be vasoconstriction and the patient is going to have painful menstruation, which is known as dysmenorrhea. Dysmenorrhea, this stands for painful. Menorrhea means menstruation. So the female is going to experience painful menstruation. On the other hand, we also know that corpus luteum is getting degenerated. Am I right? Yes, corpus luteum is getting degenerated. So as the corpus luteum is getting degenerated, the hormones which are released by the corpus luteum are, one thing is progesterone, estrogen, inhibin A. So we saw about progesterone. Progesterone loses its endometrial support. So the endometrium is going to shed out in the form of menstruation or bleeding. Right? That's the first thing. Second thing is that it is going to release the PGF2 alpha from the uterine endometrium. So vasoconstriction is going to occur. So the female is going to experience dysmenorrhea. Whereas, since corpus luteum also releases estrogen, the estrogen is going to decrease and the inhibin A is going to decrease. Since we all know that estrogen has a negative feedback on the FSH, therefore the negative feedback on the FSH is going to get lost. And since the negative feedback on FSH is going to get reduced, because the estrogen itself is getting decreased. So estrogen decrease, so the negative feedback estrogen has on FSH is going to wear off. Because estrogen is decreased, since estrogen itself is decreased, therefore the negative feedback is not going to be there. So FSH is going to increase. So since FSH is getting increased, so next it will start stimulating the follicles. It will start stimulating the primordial follicles. So the FSH will act on the granulosa cells of the follicles, and yet again the menstrual cycle, next fresh cycle, will actually begin in that female. So this was all about the menstrual cycle. So we have discussed about how the GnRH is released from the hypothalamus, how it acts on the anterior pituitary, how FSH LH is released. FSH is predominant in the first half of the cycle, LH is predominant in the second half of the cycle, why it is termed as proliferative phase, why it is termed as secretory phase, and everything, right? And we've also learned about how to calculate the day of ovulation in a female. Now, we have an important thing which is termed as LH surge, right? LH surge, which was initiated by estrogen, right? So between LH surge and ovulation, how much time is left? So actually, ideally, 24 to 36 hours is the ideal time duration between the LH surge and ovulation. So only when LH surge is going to occur, the meiotic division is going to get completed. The meiosis which was arrested in the diploidine stage of the prophase is going to get completed. So once it gets completed, the secondary oocyte and the corpus luteum is going to get released. So the ovulation is going to occur. So ideal time duration between the LH surge and the ovulation is actually 24 to 36 hours. Yes. Okay, so this is all about menstruation which you need to learn. So I hope everything is just clear for you. In case if you have any doubt, please write to us in the Mackler handle. We will reach out to you as soon as possible. So let's meet in another important session. Thank you.